The day of my husband's funeral began with silence. Not the peaceful kind people romanticize, but the heavy, waiting kind. The kind that presses against your chest when you open your eyes and remember, all at once, that the world has already moved on without asking your permission. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my body stiff, my mind floating somewhere between denial and duty. The clock on the nightstand read 6:12 a.m. I had been awake long before that, listening to the house settle, to the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall, to the sound of my own breathing, which felt too loud in a home that suddenly felt too big for one person. Today was the day I was supposed to bury my husband, the man I had shared 12 years with, the man who knew how I took my coffee without asking, the man who used to stand behind me in the kitchen and rest his chin on my shoulder when he thought I was stressed, the man who died so suddenly that my mind still refused to line up the facts in the correct order. I swung my legs out of bed and sat there for a long moment, grounding myself against the edge of the mattress. My feet touched the cold floor, and I welcomed the sensation. Pain, at least, was real. In the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My eyes were swollen, rimmed red from crying that no longer felt cathartic, just exhausting. I splashed water on my face and whispered his name under my breath, as if saying it enough times might make him answer. The black dress hung on the closet door, steamed and ready. I'd chosen it because it was simple, because it didn't draw attention, because it felt wrong to wear anything that looked like effort on a day like this. As I dressed, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. For half a second, my heart leapt in a way that made no sense. Then reality caught up. It was a text from the funeral home confirming the service time. Nothing else. No messages from my parents, no call from my sister, no check-in from my best friend, the one who'd held my hand through breakups, through job losses, through everything except this. I told myself they were probably busy, running late, driving, stuck in traffic. I told myself all the gentle lies we tell ourselves when the truth feels too sharp to touch first thing in the morning. The drive to the cemetery felt unreal, like I was watching my life through someone else's windshield. The sky was overcast, low and gray, the kind of weather people later describe as fitting, as if grief schedules the clouds. When I arrived, the parking lot was already half full. I recognized a few of my husband's coworkers, a neighbor, his cousin from out of town, people who knew him, liked him, respected him, people who showed up. I parked and sat in the car longer than necessary, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I scanned the lot, searching for familiar faces, my mother's silver sedan, my father's truck, my best friend's unmistakable red hatchback. Nothing. I told myself again, they'll be inside. The chapel smelled faintly of flowers and polished wood. Soft music played from hidden speakers, something instrumental and slow. I stepped inside, and conversations dipped, heads turned, expressions softened when they saw me. "I'm so sorry for your loss," people murmured as I passed. I nodded. I thanked them. I smiled when it felt expected, even though it felt like my face no longer belonged to me. I took my seat in the front row. The seat beside me remained empty. So did the one on the other side. As more people filtered in, the empty spaces became impossible to ignore. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting at any moment to see my mother rushing in, hair slightly out of place, eyes full of tears and apologies, or my father, stiff and uncomfortable but present, or my best friend, arms open, ready to hold me together if I fell apart. Minutes passed. The service was about to begin. I checked my phone discreetly, still nothing. That was when the first crack formed inside me, thin and sharp. The officiant approached the podium. People settled. The murmur of voices faded into silence. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the closed casket at the front of the room. This was it. This was the moment when I realized I was alone in a way I had never been before. The officiant began to speak, his voice gentle, practiced. He talked about loss, about love, about the legacy a person leaves behind. He spoke my husband's name, and my chest tightened so hard I thought I might not be able to breathe. Memories rose uninvited. The way my husband used to laugh when he thought something was genuinely funny, head tilted back, eyes closed. The way he held my hand in crowded places without even thinking about it. The way he said, "We'll figure it out," whenever life threw something at us that felt too big. I wondered what he would think if he could see this, if he could see me sitting alone in the front row, if he could see that my family wasn't here, that my parents weren't here, that my best friend wasn't here. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay upright, to stay composed. I would not fall apart in front of strangers. I would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. As the officiant continued, my mind drifted back, not to my marriage, but to my family, to the small fractures that had been there for years, the ones I'd learned to step around carefully, the way my parents always seemed to disapprove of my choices without ever quite saying it outright, the way my mother had once asked, half joking, if I was sure my husband was ambitious enough, the way my father had never quite warmed to him, never quite hidden the belief that I could have done better. Even my best friend had hesitated in the beginning. She'd said she just wanted what was best for me, that she worried I was settling, that she didn't want to see me disappointed. I'd defended him every time. I'd defended my life. I'd defended my happiness. And now, on the day that happiness was laid to rest, they weren't here. The service ended in a blur. People stood, some approached me, offering hugs, condolences, kind words that floated past me without landing. I thanked them automatically, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. Outside, the air was cooler. A light breeze stirred the trees. We gathered near the grave, the casket lowered slowly, the finality of it settling deep in my bones. Still no sign of them. I stood there, my hands shaking now, my composure finally slipping. I looked at the ground, at the flowers, at the earth that would soon cover the man I loved, and something inside me hardened. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, colder. After it was over, people lingered. Some left, others stayed to talk in low voices. Eventually, I found myself standing alone again, staring at the headstone that would soon bear my husband's name. That was when my phone buzzed. For a split second, hope flared. Then I saw the sender, my mother. The message was short. "We're sorry. Something came up. We'll talk later." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring, my hands trembling. Something came up. No explanation, no apology that felt real, no acknowledgement of what today was. Another message followed, this time from my best friend. "I didn't know how to handle this. I need some space. Please understand." I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Space. On the day I buried my husband. I slipped my phone back into my bag and stood there for a long time, letting the reality sink in fully, painfully. Nobody from my family had come, not even my parents, not even my best friend. And as I stood there alone, the grief began to shift into something else entirely, because this wasn't just about who wasn't there, it was about why. And I was starting to understand that my husband's funeral wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a truth I had been avoiding for years, one that would change everything I thought I knew about the people I came from, and about myself. The cemetery emptied slowly, like grief itself reluctant to let go. I stayed long after most people had left, long after the last polite condolences faded into awkward goodbyes. I watched strangers walk away together, leaning into one another, offering quiet support I no longer had. Eventually, even the funeral director gave me a gentle look and said I could take all the time I needed. I nodded, though time felt meaningless. When I finally turned back toward my car, the sun had broken through the clouds. The light felt wrong, too bright, too ordinary for a world that had just lost its center. The drive home was worse than the drive there. Before, I had been numb. Now, the numbness was cracking. The house greeted me with unbearable stillness. His shoes were still by the door. His jacket hung on the back of the chair where he'd tossed it a week before he died, saying he'd put it away later. Later never came. I set my keys down and slid to the floor, my back against the door, my knees pulled tight to my chest. That was when the sobbing finally came. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't quiet. It tore out of me in waves, raw and animal, like something I'd been holding back with every ounce of strength I had left. I cried for him, for us, for the future we'd planned and would never have. And then, slowly, painfully, I cried for something else. I cried because the people who were supposed to stand behind me had stepped away instead. When the storm passed, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my dress and pushed myself up. The house didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like evidence. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at the table where he and I used to eat dinner and stared at my phone, willing it to light up with something, anything that sounded like remorse. Instead, more messages came in. My sister sent a text hours later. "Mom said you're upset. We didn't think you'd want us there with everything so emotional." I read it 3 times. Didn't think I'd want them there, at my husband's funeral. I typed a response, deleted it, typed again, deleted that too. There was no sentence that could bridge that kind of disconnect. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw empty seats. I heard the officiant's voice echoing in a room where my family should have been. I replayed conversations from the past, moments that suddenly felt like warnings I'd ignored. My mother's disapproval disguised as concern. My father's silence when my husband spoke, like acknowledgement itself cost too much. My best friend's subtle distance after my wedding, the way she stopped calling as often, the way she sighed when I talked about my marriage like it was something temporary. I'd told myself it was normal. People grow apart, life gets busy. But grief has a way of stripping away comforting explanations. By morning, exhaustion sat heavy in my bones. I moved through the house mechanically, showering, changing clothes, tidying things that didn't need tidying, anything to avoid sitting still with my thoughts. The doorbell rang mid-morning. I froze. For a moment, hope flared again, stupid, reflexive hope. I opened the door to find my mother standing there, purse clutched tightly in both hands, expression tense. She stepped inside without asking. "I came as soon as I could," she said. I looked past her, half expecting my father to appear behind her. He didn't. "Yesterday," I said quietly. She waved a hand dismissively. "You know your father. He doesn't handle things like that well." "And you?" I asked. "How do you handle them?" She sighed, setting her purse down. "This isn't fair. We didn't do anything wrong." That was the moment something inside me shifted. "Sit down," I said. She frowned, but obeyed, perching on the edge of a chair like she planned to leave quickly. "Tell me," I said evenly, "why you didn't come." She looked uncomfortable. "It was complicated." "It wasn't," I replied. "It was a funeral." She bristled. "We didn't approve of your marriage. You know that." "Yes," I said. "I do." "And it felt dishonest to show up and pretend otherwise," she continued. I stared at her. "So you punished me instead." "That's not what this is," she insisted. "What is it then?" I asked, because from where I stood yesterday, it looked like abandonment. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You've always been sensitive." I laughed then, a short, sharp sound that surprised us both. "I buried my husband alone," I said. "Sensitivity isn't the issue." She stood abruptly. "We raised you better than this, to be strong." "Strong doesn't mean unsupported," I replied. She shook her head.
You chose a life we didn't agree with. Choices have consequences. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Then own that, I said. Don't pretend this was about respect or honesty. You stayed away to make a point. She didn't deny it. When she left, the house felt even emptier than before. That afternoon, my best friend finally called. I almost didn't answer. I didn't know what to do, she said immediately, her voice strained. Watching you lose him, it scared me. So you left, I said. I needed to protect myself. I closed my eyes. And who was protecting me? Silence. I've always been there for you. Always. I showed up even when it was uncomfortable. Yesterday wasn't about you. She started to cry. I didn't think you'd notice. That hurt more than anything else she could have said. After we hung up, I realized something with startling clarity. Grief wasn't just revealing who I had lost, it was revealing who I never truly had. Over the next few weeks, the world expected me to move forward. People returned casseroles, returned borrowed chairs, returned to their lives. My family resumed normal communication as if nothing monumental had happened. My mother called to discuss errands. My sister asked about holidays. My best friend sent memes, testing the waters. I responded politely, but something fundamental had changed. I stopped reaching out first. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped shrinking my pain to make others comfortable. One evening, while sorting through my husband's things, I found a letter he'd written but never sent. It was addressed to me. Inside, he'd written about how grateful he was for our life, how proud he was of the way I stood my ground, even when it was hard, how he hoped I'd never let anyone convince me that love was something I needed permission for. I sat on the floor, clutching the letter, tears sliding silently down my face.
That was when I understood. The funeral wasn't the moment I was abandoned, it was the moment I was freed. Freed from pretending, freed from chasing approval, freed from relationships that only showed up when it was convenient. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew this. I would never again beg people to stand beside me, and the ones who chose not to be there when it mattered most, they would feel that absence eventually, because I was done carrying everyone else while standing alone, and the reckoning, I was beginning to realize, had only just begun. Grief settles in layers. After the shock fades and the rituals end, what's left isn't quiet, it's loud in a subtler way. Every object becomes a reminder. Every decision feels heavier because there's no one on the other side of it anymore. I learned that in the weeks after the funeral. People assumed I was fragile, that I needed constant checking in. In reality, I was becoming something else entirely. Not hardened, not bitter, aware. My family's absence didn't just hurt, it clarified things I had spent years avoiding. I started noticing patterns. My mother called only when she needed reassurance that she hadn't done anything wrong. My sister talked about her own problems without once asking how I was sleeping. My best friend kept her distance, then sent shallow apologies late at night, the kind that feel more like guilt management than care. And every time I spoke to them, I felt smaller, not comforted, not supported, smaller. One afternoon, about a month after the funeral, my father finally called. "I hear you're not answering your mother," he said, without greeting. "I'm answering when I have the capacity," I replied. He scoffed. "You're being dramatic." There it was, the word they always used when my emotions inconvenienced them. "I buried my husband alone," I said evenly. "If that's dramatic, then yes, I am." "You're punishing us," he snapped. "No," I said, "I'm responding." He sighed heavily, like I was exhausting him. "He loved me," I said. "He showed up. That's more than I can say for you." Silence. Then coldly, "You're not thinking clearly." That was the moment I stopped trying.
I didn't argue, I didn't explain, I didn't defend my marriage, my grief, or myself. I need space, I said. Don't contact me unless you're ready to acknowledge what you did. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but my chest felt lighter than it had in weeks. Something inside me had clicked into place. I wasn't cutting them off. I was cutting the cord that kept pulling me back into the same pain. Days turned into weeks. I returned to work. People whispered condolences in the hallways, then gradually stopped. Life, relentless and unapologetic, kept moving. At home, I began sorting through things I'd been avoiding.
His clothes, his notebooks, the drawer where he kept random receipts and old ticket stubs for reasons only he understood. In one of the notebooks, I found lists, not grocery lists or work notes, plans, trips he wanted us to take, things he hoped to learn, goals he had quietly written down for us. At the bottom of one page, in his handwriting, was a sentence that stopped me cold. Make sure she knows she's enough, even when they don't. I sat there for a long time, the notebook open in my lap, tears blurring the words. He had known. He'd seen what I pretended wasn't happening, the subtle dismissals, the conditional love, the way my family measured worth. And he'd loved me anyway, fully, without reservation. That realization didn't just break my heart, it rebuilt it. The next time my mother called, I didn't ignore it. I answered calmly. "We need to talk," she said immediately. "Yes," I replied, "we do." She launched into explanations, excuses, rationalizations, how hard it was for her, how awkward the funeral would have been, how she didn't think I'd want reminders of conflict on such a sad day. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "You made my husband's death about your discomfort." "That's not fair," she protested. "It's accurate," I said, "and until you can admit that, we don't have a relationship." Her voice sharpened. "So you're cutting us out now?" "I'm setting terms," I replied. "There's a difference." She was quiet. "I need an apology," I continued. "Not a justification, not a defense. An apology." "For what?" she asked stiffly. "For not showing up when I needed you most," I said. "For prioritizing your feelings over my grief." She didn't respond. After a long pause, she said, "I'm sorry you felt hurt." I closed my eyes. "That's not an apology," I said. "Call me when you're ready to give one." I hung up. That night, I slept better than I had since the funeral, not because things were resolved, but because I had finally spoken the truth out loud. A few days later, my best friend showed up at my door, unannounced. She looked nervous, unsure, like she was bracing for rejection. "I know I messed up," she said. I stepped aside to let her in. We sat across from each other, the space between us filled with years of shared history and recent disappointment. "I didn't come because I couldn't handle it. Watching you lose him terrified me. It made everything feel too real. I wasn't asking you to fix it. I was asking you to stand next to me." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I know, and I failed." I studied her face. This wasn't deflection. This wasn't blame. This was ownership. "I don't know if I can trust you the same way," I said honestly. She nodded. "I don't expect you to. I just didn't want to disappear without trying." We talked for hours about fear, about avoidance, about the ways people disappoint each other not out of malice, but weakness. When she left, nothing was magically repaired, but something had shifted. She had shown up late, but she had shown up. That mattered. My family, on the other hand, stayed silent. Weeks passed without a word, then months. I began to rebuild my life deliberately. I changed routines. I took a class I'd always wanted to try. I made friends who didn't know my past, who only knew the woman standing in front of them. I stopped waiting for my phone to buzz, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ache softened. One afternoon, I visited the cemetery again. I brought fresh flowers and the letter he'd written me. I sat beside his grave and read it aloud, my voice steady. "I'm okay," I told him, not because this didn't destroy me, but because it didn't define me. As I stood to leave, my phone rang. My mother. I let it ring. Then, unexpectedly, a message followed. "I was wrong. I should have been there. I'm sorry." No qualifiers, no excuses, no self-protection, just words. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, "Thank you for saying that. I'm not ready yet, but I appreciate the honesty." She didn't respond, and that was okay. Healing doesn't rush. It doesn't erase. It reorders. What I learned in the months after my husband's funeral was this: loss doesn't just take, it reveals. It strips away illusions. It exposes the scaffolding beneath your life. It shows you who stands firm and who disappears when things get heavy. Nobody from my family came to my husband's funeral, not even my parents, not even my best friend. But in their absence, I found something unexpected: my own strength and the courage to stop begging for love that only shows up when it's easy. Because from that day forward, I decided I would never again sit alone in the front row of my own life. And the story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot.
The apology didn't fix anything. That surprised me at first. For weeks, I'd imagined that if my mother ever admitted she was wrong, something inside me would loosen, that the ache would dull, that relief would wash over me, and I'd finally feel like myself again. Instead, her message sat on my phone like a stone. "I was wrong. I should have been there. I'm sorry." Simple, direct, long overdue, and still insufficient. Because apologies don't rewind time. They don't put people back in chairs that stayed empty. They don't stand beside you when your knees are shaking and your entire life is being lowered into the ground. They arrive after the damage, when the cost has already been paid. I didn't respond again, not because I was angry, because I was listening to myself. Something in me needed quiet, space to understand who I was becoming, now that grief was no longer screaming, just humming steadily beneath everything. That's when the invitations started. First, from my sister: "Family dinner this Sunday. Mom wants us all together." No acknowledgement, no mention of the funeral, no recognition of the rupture, just an expectation that I'd step back into my old role. I declined. Then my father left a voicemail: "You're tearing this family apart." I deleted it. A month later, my mother showed up again. This time, she knocked. I opened the door and saw her standing there with a casserole dish, the universal symbol of "I want forgiveness without a real conversation." "I made your favorite," she said, attempting a smile. I didn't move aside. "We need to talk first," I replied. Her smile faltered. "I thought we were past that." "No," I said calmly. "We're past pretending." She sighed and stepped inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my husband and I had planned vacations, argued gently about paint colors, and eaten countless quiet dinners together. She glanced around, taking in the house like it was evidence. "You've changed," she said. "Yes," I replied. "Trauma tends to do that." She flinched. I apologized. "You acknowledged," I corrected. "Those aren't the same thing." Her posture stiffened. "What more do you want from me?" The question landed heavy. "I want accountability," I said. "I want you to say you chose your comfort over my pain. I want you to admit that you punished me for marrying someone you didn't approve of, even in death." She looked down at her hands.
We just didn't think that marriage would last. My chest tightened. So, when it ended, I said quietly, you felt justified. She didn't deny it. That was the moment I realized something crucial. My family hadn't abandoned me out of confusion or fear. They had abandoned me out of judgment.
I loved him, I said, my voice steady despite the ache, and he loved me. That should have been enough. She looked up then, tears in her eyes. I didn't know how to support something I didn't believe in. Then you should have supported me, I replied. Instead, you disappeared. She reached across the table. I pulled my hand back. I'm not here to punish you, I continued, but I won't pretend this didn't fundamentally change how safe I feel with you. Her voice trembled. So what now? I leaned back in my chair. Now we rebuild, slowly, on new terms, or we don't. She stared at me like she didn't recognize her daughter anymore. And maybe she didn't. The daughter who begged for approval was gone. The daughter sitting across from her had buried a husband and survived abandonment. That changes a person. After she left, I felt drained, but grounded. For the first time, I wasn't questioning whether I was being too harsh. I was honoring what I needed. Over the next few weeks, my family tried different tactics. My sister accused me of holding grudges. My father framed himself as the victim. My mother oscillated between guilt and defensiveness. I didn't engage. Instead, I focused on what was growing quietly in my life. Friendships that showed up without being asked, coworkers who checked in consistently, a neighbor who brought soup and stayed to talk, not because she felt obligated, but because she cared. Support doesn't always come from where you expect. Sometimes it comes from where you finally allow it. One evening, my best friend came over again. She'd been trying, genuinely this time, showing up, listening without centering herself, sitting with me in silence when words felt wrong. I'm proud of you, she said softly as we drank tea. For what? For not folding, she said. Old you would have smoothed this over by now. I smiled faintly. Old me thought peace meant compliance. And now? Now I know peace requires honesty, even when it costs me. She nodded. I'm sorry it took me failing you to learn that. I believed her. That mattered. Months passed. The sharpness of grief softened into something more manageable, not smaller, just integrated. My husband was still everywhere, in habits, in phrases I caught myself repeating, in moments when something made me laugh and my first instinct was still to turn and tell him. But the pain no longer felt like drowning. It felt like carrying a weight I had learned to balance. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, from my father. I almost didn't open it. Inside, his handwriting was stiff, uneven. It read, I don't know how to say this out loud, so I'm writing it instead. I failed you. I thought staying away was a form of honesty. It was cowardice. I'm sorry. I sat with that letter for a long time, not because it erased anything, but because it was the first time he had ever admitted fault without blaming me.
I wrote back, not forgiveness, acknowledgement. Thank you for owning that. I need time. That was enough for now. What surprised me most wasn't how much I'd lost. It was how much lighter I felt without constantly trying to be understood by people unwilling to listen. Grief had stripped my life down to its essentials, and in the quiet that followed, I rebuilt something truer. I learned that family isn't defined by proximity or obligation, but by presence. That love without action is just a word. That boundaries don't mean rejection. They mean self-respect. And that being alone is sometimes less painful than being surrounded by people who don't see you. The funeral marked the end of my marriage, but it also marked the beginning of my clarity. And as I stood one evening at the window, watching the sun set over a life I was slowly reclaiming, I knew something with certainty. The hardest part was over, but the final reckoning,
The moment when everyone truly understood what their absence had cost, that was still coming. And when it did, I would not be afraid. The reckoning didn't arrive with shouting. It didn't come wrapped in drama or ultimatums. It arrived quietly, the way real consequences always do, when people finally realize that the door they assumed would always be open isn't. By the time winter came, my life had settled into a new rhythm. Mornings were still hard. I still reached across the bed sometimes, half asleep, expecting warmth that wasn't there. Grief didn't vanish. It learned how to coexist, but it no longer controlled me. What surprised me most was how stable I felt. For the first time in my life, I wasn't managing other people's emotions. I wasn't softening my words. I wasn't apologizing for needing support. I wasn't chasing love that arrived conditionally. The silence from my family stretched longer than any argument ever had. At first, they seemed to believe this was temporary, that eventually I would cave, that I'd miss holidays too much, that loneliness would bring me back into alignment. They misunderstood something fundamental. I wasn't lonely. I was finally at peace. The first real shift came around the holidays, Thanksgiving specifically. My sister called 3 days before. "We're all getting together," she said, casual but strained. "Mom expects you." I smiled to myself. "I won't be coming." There was a pause. Still holding on to this? This isn't something I'm holding. It's something I set down. She exhaled sharply. "You're making things awkward." "No," I said calmly. "I'm making things honest." She scoffed. "You've changed." "Yes," I said again. "That keeps coming up." She hung up without saying goodbye. Thanksgiving morning was quiet. I cooked for myself. Not out of sadness, but intention. I made the dishes my husband loved. I sat one place at the table and didn't pretend otherwise. I spoke to him out loud as I cooked. "You'd be proud of me," I said, stirring the pot. I finally stopped trying to earn love. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. Photos. The family table. Forced smiles, too many empty chairs. No message, just evidence. I didn't respond. That night, my mother called. Her voice was different, less defensive, more tired. "This feels wrong," she said quietly. "What does?" I asked. "You not being here," she admitted. I considered that. "It felt wrong burying my husband without you," I replied. "This is just uncomfortable. That was devastating." She was silent. "I don't say that to hurt you," I continued. "I say it because until you understand the difference, nothing changes." Her voice cracked. "I didn't think you'd really walk away." "I didn't walk away," I said gently. "I stopped walking toward people who weren't walking toward me." That was the first time she cried on the phone without trying to justify herself. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "You don't fix it, you respect it, and you show up differently, consistently." It took months, not days, not weeks, months. My father started calling occasionally, not to lecture, not to correct, but to ask questions. Awkward ones, uncomfortable ones. "What was he like with you? Were you happy? Did we miss things we shouldn't have?" I answered honestly, without exaggeration, without bitterness, just truth. My sister resisted the longest. She hated that I no longer reacted, that guilt didn't work, that obligation bounced off me like rain on glass. One day, out of frustration, she snapped, "You act like you're better than us now." I looked at her calmly. "No," I said, "I act like I know my worth." She didn't respond. That silence told me everything. The real reckoning came the following spring. My mother had a health scare. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to shake her sense of certainty. She called me from the hospital.
"I want you here," she said. "Not we need you, not you should come. I want you here." I paused.
"I can come," I said slowly, "but not as the daughter who absorbs blame or pretends nothing happened." "I know," she said. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't." When I walked into that hospital room, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not resentment, not triumph, clarity. She looked smaller than I remembered, less certain, less guarded. She reached for my hand. "I was wrong," she said again. "About him, about you, about what love looks like." I didn't cry. I squeezed her hand. "That matters," I said. Recovery didn't erase history, but it changed the future. Boundaries remained. Expectations were different. I no longer bent myself into shapes that fit other people's comfort. And something unexpected happened. They adjusted. Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. As for my best friend, she became one of the few people who earned her way back fully. She showed up on hard days. She listened without interrupting. She never again centered herself in my pain. Trust didn't snap back into place. It grew, slowly, deliberately, earned. On the anniversary of my husband's death, I returned to the cemetery, alone. Not because I had no one, but because this moment was mine. I sat beside his grave and spoke softly. "They didn't come," I said, "but I did, and I keep showing up. For myself." The wind moved gently through the trees. I felt him there, not as absence, but as foundation, because loving him had taught me something no one else ever had, that love isn't conditional, that loyalty isn't performative, that presence matters more than approval. Nobody from my family came to my husband's funeral, not even my parents, not even my best friend, and for a long time I thought that was the deepest wound, but it wasn't. The deepest wound would have been continuing to accept that kind of love. Grief broke me open, but what filled the space afterward was strength, was clarity, was a life no longer negotiated by fear of abandonment. I didn't lose my family that day. I lost the illusion that they would always show up, and in that loss, I gained something far more powerful, myself.